Patricia Clough is, as I said, one of the contributors to the handbook, and then she's well known to those of you at Queen's and the Graduate Centre. She's written widely on feminist theory, technology, affect, the human body. I think, like a lot of us in this room, our generation, she started in symbolic interactionism and Marxism, and has progressed through.
Has progressed.
And is still progressing.
Still progressing.
So, without more ado, thank you very much, Patricia.
Hopefully, progressing. I thought I would just say that this is a difficult paper, not unnecessarily, because the work is difficult and I've done my best to make it easier. But I'm going to read, because if I start talking, I'll spend an hour on the first sentence. Victoria and I were just talking about thinking through feminism, or feminist studies, or feminist theory, which is, as Brian said, was a place that I began. And then it seemed difficult to stay there for a variety of reasons, political. I don't mean that I left it, but other things were happening that seemed important to go to. And even things in science and technology. And now we like to say, oh, but the feminists always knew this. And in some ways that's true. So this is not a rediscovery of those feminists. This is actually about feminists who are doing work today. And the reason why the work's a little bit difficult is they're doing this spectacular thing, actually, and I'm just going to talk about three of them, of sort of looking at certain philosophical traditions and looking at contemporary science, really contemporary science. And so, although leaning on 3 decades of feminist science studies, trying to think what the new sciences are asking us to use as a framework. So rather than use old frameworks, let's say, or enduring frameworks on new science, they're doing everything at once. New frameworks, new science. They're leaning on philosophers, and my interest, really, I think in the end, is the different kind of configurations you get, depending on whether you're using Whitehead or Deleuze, or which philosopher you're using to sort of balance yourself. Because these are critical works, of course, because they're feminists. So there's the good thing. Okay. There is a new cohort of feminist scholars who are resetting the agenda for critical engagement with technoscientific research that is resonant with what recently has been called the new materialisms, a tag which might well cover affect studies, animal studies, posthumanist studies, new media studies, interspecies studies, and disability studies. My entry for the encyclopedia draws on my ongoing engagement with a number of these feminist science studies scholars who are following developments in technosciences such as nanotechnology, quantum physics, neurophysiology, epigenetics, and computational studies. Good thing I'm an expert in all of those, because that helps. Today, I will be narrowing my focus considerably, exploring the work of Karen Barad, Elizabeth Gross, and Luciana Parisi. I think there's a number of you who might know all three. I hope some of you know at least one or two of them. I'm looking at their work in order to shed light on the so-called new materialisms in relationship to bodies and science technology. I also should add that my own slant on the works of these scholars is strongly influenced by critical work in media and technology, especially digital technology, including biotechnologies, or what Eugene Thacker has called biomedia. So sometimes people look at the body, works in the body, but they don't look at work in technology at the same time. And there are people in technology that do one kind of thing, they don't do the other kind, and so it's a lot of work to bring it together. Since my early studies at the Biological Computer Lab for research in cybernetics, neuroscience, biology, genetics, and mathematics, I have understood the body, and that was like many, many years ago, I have understood the body as inextricable from technology or technoscience. That is, I conceive bodies beyond the deconstructed opposition of body and technology, nature, and culture. We've been deconstructing that for a long time, and really a lot of these feminists are working beyond that, taking it for granted. Taking up the work of Parisi, Barad, and Gross helps us engage the new materialism, which grew out of the perceived limitations of the cultural turn that focused attention primarily on discourse, language, or textuality. This new materialisms instead urge a renewed approach to matter and processes of materialization that recognize matter to be immanently vital, neither inert nor dead, but rather self-organizing, or as I like to put it, informational. Matter is informational. While not simply a rejection of the function of language, text, or discourse in the study of culture and sociology, the more immediate concern for the new materialisms is the way developments in technoscience are pressuring an a-humanist, or if we must, post-humanist rethinking of ontology and epistemology, seeking a rearticulation of the ontological grounds for conceiving and experiencing without presuming the centrality of human consciousness or unconsciousness. So most of our ontology and epistemology has worked with that presumption. So this is an effort to not center consciousness or unconsciousness, not necessarily just remove them. The new materialisms, Donna Poole and Samantha Frost suggest, are rediscovering a materiality that materializes, evincing imminent modes of self-transformation that compel us to think of causation in far more complex terms, to consider anew the location and nature of capacities for agency. Or simply put, people are finding activity, agency in what we used to think was dead or inert. So animal studies, posthumanism, disability studies, and affect studies fall under this rubric. But two aspects of the new materialism's agenda are particularly relevant for me. One is the call for critical scholarship to attend to the sciences once again, and to take up the massive development of digital or computational technologies upon which these sciences are profoundly dependent. Can't do any of them anymore without technology, especially digital technology dependent. They're dependent not only for the specific ways digital technologies can materialize thought, providing a means of evidencing or measuring. These sciences sort of do and measure themselves at the same time, as you'll hear. It's very exciting. But also for the way these technologies render through aesthetic means the abstract but often socially, psychologically, and politically weighty implications of science research. So there's, as some of you know, a great deal of interesting science imaging that's almost a whole subject in itself. But I'm also thinking, because some of us here in the audience are working on this, big data, beautiful evidencing. So there's you may be reading lately about how data is used studying itself. And then two, the new sciences that the new materialisms take up point to non-organic life, or the porousness of the organism, especially the human organism, leading to questioning whether the organism can continue to be the privileged figure of bodies and of life across various platforms. So people are taking quite seriously that life is in other platforms besides human bodily platforms. I'm thinking of technology, of course. The increasingly felt effects of quantum physics, microbiology, evolutionary biology, neuroscience, and nanotechnologies are surely making us rethink the body as organism, or making necessary a reconfiguration of the organism, media, and time-space. And we should really think of those things together, I think. Or what I will discuss as speed, or better even, exposure. So a little bit about the works of the feminist scholars I promised to share with you. As early as 1998, which is now a long time ago, Karen Barad would offer a critique of Judith Butler's treatment of bodily matter in an essay titled Getting Real, Technoscientific Practices and the Materialization of Reality. As if to make her point from the very start of her essay, Barad would follow an opening epigram drawn from Foucault's description of the disciplined body, with a quote focusing on another body, the piezoelectric crystal. Rather than take the human body as her subject matter, Barad takes up a material instrument, the soul of an observing apparatus, I'm quoting, through which not simply signals but discourse in the Foucauldian sense operate. A material instrument, the soul of an observing apparatus. following Donna Haraway's conception of agency. So I should say, you know, this beginning is about Barad, who's really trying to tell us that that the measuring apparatus and the materialization that's materialized through the measuring apparatus cannot be separated from each other. It's a little bit different than what we've thought of as social constructionism, and she's only a starting point for me, because then I'm going to move to someplace even a little, you know, more interesting to me, and I hope to you. So following Donna Haraway's conception of agency in terms of what Haraway already had called material semiotic objects, Barad develops her conception of a gentle realism, which would allow her to pay attention to matter in a way Judith Butler did not do in her own famous treatment of bodily matter. The argument always was that Butler assumed matter, and really it's culture, edible structures of culture that make that matter bodily alive. As Barad sees it, Butler had theorized how the human body came to matter as a sex body, but she did not do so by showing how discourse mattered. But she did so by showing how discourse mattered in materializing the body. What she did not do, Barad proposes, was show how matter came to matter. Here again, Butler's account of the body is criticized for treating matter as passive, inert, receptive to and dependent on discourse for material transformations. Barad suggests that a return to the question of agency in relationship to matter is necessary, also requiring rethinking performativity and realism. Barad begins a revision of Butler by turning to technology, to what Barad calls technologies of embodiment. Drawing momentum from works of feminists studying technologies, reproductive technologies especially, this is 1998, Barad goes on to offer an ontology of bodies by showing the way matter comes to matter through an entanglement of discourse and a measuring or observing apparatus in an experimental or performative context. Some of you know that I'm absolutely wildly engaged with the notion of measuring and evidence. Barad, because if you're thinking causality in more complicated ways, we really don't know where the measuring or evidence is, but for sure it's not at the end. Barad takes as her primary example the work of Niels Bohr and his search for a coherent interpretation of quantum physics. Barad proposes that Bohr's search should be a guide, showing us that the question of bodies and technologies necessarily is a question of scientific method and objective measure. The question of bodies and technologies is necessarily a question of scientific method and objective measure. For those of you, we were talking, and I know I didn't hear all of Arthur's, I'm sure, wonderful engagement with students this morning, but embodiment, or even Victoria, see, but she's not embodied at the moment. Even Victoria, we were talking about embodiment. I think that embodiment in the whole phenomenological tradition is really what's up for grabs here. Because embodiment for a lot of philosophies means still through consciousness and conscious awareness. And this is about embodiments that involve measuring apparatuses, so it goes clang, 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 it's cold, and it doesn't feel like it has consciousness. And it's a great question still before us, by the way. Nothing that I'm saying is settled in my mind or anywhere else, for that matter. The question of bodies and technologies necessarily is a question of scientific method and objective measure. Moved by critiques of representationalism that feminists already had developed, I hope you know what that means. Barad will further revise method and measure toward a realism commensurate with Bohr's perspective, which holds the inseparability of the object of observation and the agencies of observation. Can't separate them, of course, in quantum physics. Indeed, the emergent and co-constitution of object and agencies, such that there is an interdependence of material and conceptual constraints and exclusions, demanding a reformulation of causality and the material conditions for objective knowledge. Thus, Barad offers as a starting point the proposition that, and I love this quote, theoretical concepts are defined by the circumstances required for their measurement. Theoretical concepts are defined by the circumstances required for their measurement. We often have been taught, do theory, do your methods, do your measurement, write up your... This is not what's happening here, because no conceptualization in quantum physics can happen without it already being attached. And when I say technology, don't think of things like that. Think of a mathematical technology, an algorithm, think of what can be repeated, might be the best thing to say. Hi, baby. Are you back there? So listen for when the baby goes, what? Because that means I'm telling the truth then. Thus, how am I doing, Arthur, on the baby jokes? Thus, the discursive is always part of an intra-actional performativity, part of the particular technological arrangements that define concepts. Barad's performativity, therefore, differs from Butler's in that it is not a mediation of signifiers, but rather a formation relative to an observing or measuring apparatus. A really big move, and a move back to the sciences in a way, not uncritically. Of course, the question of measure looms large in quantum mechanics, given the impossibility of simultaneously measuring the position and momentum of an electron, so that the materialization of particle or wave is dependent on the particular measuring device in a particular experimental setting. Drawing on this characteristic of quantum measure, Barad makes clear that the performativity of different measures is not about the uncertainty of the observer. It is not an epistemological matter only. We can't know, so we do the other things. But it is about the indeterminate nature of matter. And I remember reading Heisenberg for the first time with students who, Bohr, but also Heisenberg, where he also, we've always used Heisenberg principle to be an epistemological relativistic principle, but in fact he says, like on page 3, no, this is not epistemology, this is the nature of matter. I was very excited when I first read that. Observer, but about the indeterminate nature of matter, wave or particle, an ontological position rather than an epistemological one. Matter is indeterminate because that is how it acts under conditions of measure. We're with Barad. Matter is indeterminate because that's how it acts under conditions of measure in the context of a specific experiment. To emphasize the inseparability of measured and measuring in the context of experimentation, Barad introduces the idea of interaction, displacing interaction with a where a dichotomy always is reinscribed, interacting. Interaction is the production of a performative measure, an assembling of the measured and the measuring that constitutes a determinate body to which the measure retroactively has reference, as does conceptualization. So you produce something through a performativity that you then retroactively see the thing you produced. I could do better with that, but it would take a little more. So it is not a maybe I will. So it is not a pre-existent physical object that is measured. It is measure which performatively produces a determinate body or a phenomena, here's Barad's words, a phenomenon without consciousness. Out of the indeterminacy of matter, what we might take to be a production of a surplus of being, or better, a surplus of ordering in matter. While for Barad, performativity is a way to account for the different phenomena that are produced with measuring. Measuring is irreducible to human agency or human agency alone. So this was a big move towards post-humanism. In interaction, all relevant features of the experimental arrangement count, and as such are inseparable from the measured. What the measured does is exclude possibilities such that wave is produced rather than particle, or particle is produced rather than wave, by exclusion, or none. Following Bohr, Barad concludes that the classical idea of causality no longer fits. Causality is not a matter of an observation-independent object, no independent observation, but a matter of phenomenon, and that's why she calls it phenomenon, because it's not separate from an arrangement that excludes others. There are conditions these are the conditions of objective knowledge. Barad, and non-conscious, because not just human. Barad's A Gentle Realism has produced implications for an ontology of bodies, which she draws out by elaborating the meaning of apparatus, moving beyond Bohr's theorizing of it back to Foucault's theorization of the body practices in political and social terms. Turning to Foucault's treatment of disciplinary apparatuses, or what he also has called apparatuses of observation, do you remember, or apparatuses of production. Barad focuses on the way Foucault points to the panopticon as a technology that served as an observing instrument for making disciplined bodies. For Foucault, while the bodies produced by these technological practices do not pre-exist them, he does not emphasize, as Barad would want him to do, the interaction of bodily matter. She therefore returns to the piezoelectric transducer to further elaborate her idea of a gentle realism in interactional bodies. She makes the case that in ultrasonography, the transducer does not allow us to peer innocently at the fetus, nor does it simply offer constraints on what we can see. Rather, it helps produce and is part of the body it images. Big statement on fetuses. Baby? Okay. For Barad, then, the sonogram, no comment. I think that's right. I think that's good for the baby. I know the mother might agree, right? Maybe not. For Barad, then, the sonogram refers not to a physical object we might call the fetus, but is itself part of the phenomena referenced by the observation or measure. Of course, the apparatus is as well, and we can think of all these little photographs now that I have on my iPhone of my forthcoming second grandchild. I get a little, sonogram. I look at little him. To him, Patricia. For Barad, bodies arise. No, I've been too cute because I lost my place. For Barad, then, the sonogram refers not to. Of course, the apparatus is as well co-produced, as the apparatus does not pre-exist the measuring. Ultrasonography is part of a range of practices involving many other material configurations and discursive formations, and we can go all the way out to political economy. And here the body cannot be separated from the apparatus except in its exclusion of other bodies. In the time of the measure, boundaries are produced. Beyond each measure, what we take to be the same body, in fact, is another body. That's a big move. Every time the body is different through measuring, even though we think that's the same baby all the time. Although maybe you know how it isn't, because you're seeing something really close, right? A body produced differently each time. A gentle reality is continually reconstituted through the material discursive interactions. Interactionality is constraining rather than determining. Interactional reality remains uncertain, open to be reconfigured. For Barad, bodies arise interactionally as phenomenon, and therefore interactional bodies are not just a matter of shaping the surface of a body or a body's morphology, as Butler proposed. You know, she made all the sexual holds come alive, but the body itself. Barad is taking up the very atoms or the very volume of bodies as non-conscious phenomena, not as a citational iteration, although post-structuralism, but an interactional iteration. For Barad, interactionality is how bodies materialize, how bodies, boundaries and volumes are produced. It is only through interaction of observed and observing or measuring apparatus that there is a gentle cut able to reconfigure matter, reconfiguring bodies and separations, or where indeterminacy is resolved for specific experimentation. So everybody's uncertain until you make the measure, then things sort of becomes resolved. As such, Barad recasts agency. For her, agency is not something possessed. Agency is making changes to particular human and non-human practices. Making changes to practices. Like causality, agency in the interactional production of non-conscious phenomena, or what Barad also calls things in phenomena. Rather than things being entities behind phenomena, or being things in themselves, phenomena are prior to any given or pre-existing relator. I want you to notice that because that's the big change coming. There's nothing there. Everything arises in measure, in matter. There may be matter there, but it's measuring devices all the way down. So there's no relator that you bring together. This is the force of interactionality that you don't have relator. Oh, a little shower. While Barad, so I'm shifting now to really the only other thing I'm going to talk about at great length, so I hope you're okay. While Barad treats bodies as interactional phenomena, so everything happens through discourse and da-da-da, she hasn't moved a whole lot away from sort of a cultural discursive thing. Most important is to not ever be just human. And she's done a lot of work to really make that be meaningful. While Barad treats bodies as interactional phenomena that are both human and non-human, Nonetheless, it is not clear how one phenomenon or body becomes another. Or to put it another way, it is interactional phenomena all the way down. In her critique of Barad, Luciana Parisi would ask if Barad's elevation of quantum mechanics to metaphysics does not risk reiterating the discursive approach to science which she wanted to refuse, insofar as by rejecting what is given in materiality, relata maybe, that is abstract bodies, the given or pre-existing relata. She also rejects what is implied in quantum mechanics, the event of experiencing quantum imperceptibles before these acquire the qualitative properties of phenomena, even non-conscious ones. Okay, the silence is deep now. Because that's hard. Because, I know where we've all been. Cultural construction, there's no nothing but cultural construction. So we're making a move to see maybe something is given. Now when we use the word given, it's not an empiricism of it's there so much as accepting of a different philosophy. But attached to that philosophy, which will be Whitehead's philosophy, because you remember that Barad is trying to take consciousness away, not spread consciousness out. So you could start thinking not just human consciousness, but many consciousness. And that's really what Whitehead did, among other things. And so we're going to go there. But along with that, there's an attachment here to another kind of experience, a real experience that's also virtual for us, because we can't see it and we can't get to it. The experience of imperceptibles in quantum. Barad sort of removed imperceptibles because she shifted from this and this. So what's in between? Like if you can shift from this to that, what's in between? So I always love the in-betweens. And so some people have found an in-between. Here it goes. In putting abstract bodies against Barad's interactional bodies, Parisi wants to theorize the in-between of bodies. Against Barad's rejection of the experience of the imperceptible quantum, Parisi elaborates a materialism of continuity. By treating bodies in terms of a materialism of continuity that allows for the experience of imperceptibles and takes reality not as a gentle, realist interactivities, but as the occurrence of singular events, as throbs of experience and duration. It's a huge move to time. And the reason we can move to time with Parisi is because she really knows a lot about digital mathematical technologies. And we can measure at these imperceptible levels because digital is fast. And what we get by fast is to be able to attach to things that are already moving, not things that are still or need to be made still. So we can attach to rhythmicities and energies and movement in general. So you won't hear so much the word agency, but you will hear movement and experience. And for those of you who've been doing affect, you know this is close to a definition of affect in the Deleuzian sense. And Parisi is a Deleuzian Whiteheadian. Parisi also draws on quantum physics, whereas Barad, like Bohr, only allows quantum imperceptibles to be real in being of an interactional measure. Parisi takes the imperceptibles, or the pre-individualities, to use Gilbert Simondon's term, to be indeterminate or virtual, to use Deleuze's term, and yet experienceable as such. So, I'm sorry, but you have to kind of know that virtuality is potential, and it is experientiable. If not by us, you'll see by other things, but also sometimes by us. Indeterminate virtual, to use Deleuze's term, and yet experienceable as such. Of course, we must not think only of humans' experience here. Indeed, in taking up Parisi and her treatment of quantum, I am moving us toward a dynamic immanent to matter, or a matter that is informational, matter that forms itself, measures itself, or experiences itself, perhaps. The itself is a good question there. As Elizabeth Gross would put it, matter contains a vibratory rhythm, ongoing events, I'm quoting, a dynamism that exceeds its strictly material qualities. There is a vital impulse that pulses through all of matter, for matter is tendency, laden with singularities, pre-individualities, a plethora of powers that orients matter to creative formations. Whereas Gross is concerned with rethinking the relationship of life, matter, biology, evolution, and philosophy, Parisi is rethinking mathematics, physics, evolution, and philosophy. In treating Parisi's work, it's very important which things they're bringing together. In treating Parisi's work, then, a brief overview of the developments in mathematics is necessary. But first, let me turn to Parisi's philosophy, because her take on quantum, Parisi turns to Alfred North Whitehead's reading of it, and his understanding of discrete objects or occasions, and the experience of the time of becoming. So we're putting discrete things together with the experience of a continuity, so that we don't just have flow, we also have things forming, which is a little different than Deleuze. Beginning with Whitehead's definition of event as the dawning and perishing of an actual object, an experience of the passing from one state to another, from one present into another past. Parisi proposes that what is becoming is the experiencing of the continuity between one occurrence or object and another. This is what Whitehead describes as concretions, or the actual becoming of an object through a novel production of togetherness, or the coming together of multiple prehensions, where prehension is the preconscious, pre-individual act by which one actual occasion takes up and responds to another. I love to give the example here of Prigoghine's little molecules. Prigogine sort of noted, it's known, I read this in Masumi for those of you reading Masumi, that there's an occasion where they note there's molecules like hanging out wherever they hang out.
Yeah.
And they don't know why, but suddenly they order themselves, and in doing that they gain gravity, or what I called before an excess of being or order. And it's not clear why, but we see one to the next, but there's a whole experience in there of continuity and time. And more, I think what we're looking at is as a mathematical technology that can touch that or manipulate that or make that weirdly productive. Let us not forget capitalism is financing all of this. This is what Whitehead describes here. It determines neither a cognitive act of observation, out with the observation, nor a sensory motor response. Prehension may be better described as propensity to feel before sensing, or an abstract sensation that is non-sensuous, an affect or vector connecting here with there, and immediately before and after. Prehensions are passages between dimensions of time. Everything, not just human, prehends, in that each object orients toward, withdrawing from, or advancing toward the world. It's very beautiful, actually, to read Whitehead. That is to say, prehension is a decision, to use Whitehead's term, delimiting a specific occasion or object, which after perishing becomes the past or datum for another occasion. For Whitehead, there also is the prehension of potentiality, or and I was thinking of pragmatism when I'm reading Whitehead sometimes, Arthur, and need and time, yeah. Whitehead's term delimits at another occasion. For Whitehead, there also is prehension of potentiality, or what he calls eternal objects. So we don't just prehend, but we also prehend like wanting more potentiality, such that the appetite for potentialities or indeterminacy is never extinguished in the dawning and perishing of any object. This is to say, in the eternal return of, in the eternal return of potentiality, indetermination enters each actual occasion or object when it is selected and allows at its perishing an afterlife of potential for the dawning of another object. As synthesizer, there's a number of us in this room who know how much we've had to read to just say that sentence from the Whitehead group here. As synthesizers of asymmetric forces for the production of a higher yet infinitesimal unity, prehensions and their concretions allow for both continuity and discreteness. Whitehead refers to this as extension, the most general scheme of real potentiality. Parisi puts Whitehead's thought to use in taking up what Deleuze and Guattari conceive of as an abstract machine or a machinic assemblage, which he describes as, listen to how pretty this is, the gelling together of pre-individualities, a felt continuum that embeds discrete bodies within a field, growing by its edges, adding and subtracting components, an ontogenetic process in which all elements play a part, and yet no element can form a whole. Differing with Barad, Parisi argues that the abstract machine permits a connection between things without the necessity that they be phenomena. Rather, there are the insides of and the spaces between atoms, the atomic and subatomic particles, and now this is the big word for the next and last bunch, an incomputable materiality, which is nonetheless held together in virtuality. I'm very interested in incomputable measures, mostly because I don't know what that is. In contrast to or we'd have to really think differently to play around with that idea. In contrast to a gentle interaction, there is an experiencing of virtuality, what Parisi describes as a real experience of time as a continuous relation of enveloping, and space as a relation of linkage, where experience, however, is effective and not only human. There's a kind of freedom here that seems absent from interaction, in that there are occasions that begin and end without end, or not without ending and falling back into potential, all independent of the observer's choice of reference. Oh, this is happening without a point of reference that is an observer that stands outside of it, or even is mixed in with it. The event of an occasion is unique, a decision, a freedom, because the occasion is free from determination by an observer or observing apparatus. Let's talk about this, because it's a big move. There is no situating the object within an experimentation or measure. Doesn't mean you can't, but that isn't what it's dependent on for ontological reality. Its ontological reality is virtual. But if for Parisi, this freedom is not without measure, it is a measuring that differs from Barad's. The difference follows on Parisi's assumption, like Deleuze and Whitehead, of the ontological givenness of the virtual, or potential, that the virtual is real and really experienced. And remember, that's by many, everything in the world. This assumption is what I am calling matter as informational, referring to the immanent time, space, or potential of matter to measure itself. And I'm drawing on my favorite quantum physicist, David Bohm. And as such, the measure that Parisi takes account of is linked to those advances in mathematics that are attempting to afford architectural software programming, the ability to operate on the information or numbers between 0 and 1, to move from linearity, points and lines, to curvilinearity. Drawing on the work of mathematician Gregory Chapin, Parisi argues that this is essential mathematics and would add to the calculus of probabilities, our big way of counting, vague or incomplete quantities at the limits of zeros and ones, or a mathematics that directs itself to the full, densely packed zones of information that are the intensive surrounds of zeros and ones. Isn't it great to think that little zeros and ones have all this stuff like around them? These zeros are defined, these zones are defined by an intrinsic numerical variability which remains computationally open. There is a transformation of the logic of binary states, yes and no, or Boolean algebra, into the fuzzy states of maybes and perhaps. And you know, I studied cybernetics when I was like 10 years old, and they were looking so hard for three-value logic because it really gives a whole different kind of potential to computing. And this is not merely a matter of qualitative renderings of a digital binarism. For those of you who know Catherine Hales, this is not like analog, digital, analog. It's not like you go in with meaning, you do something, come out with meaning. This is not an adding to digital binarisms, but are to be understood in terms of new processes of quantification. Here, the computation remains open, or extension becomes inflection or infection. And then when it's done. Notice that extension becomes infection. You know what infection is? It's viral. If I say viral, you'll get it better, right? And let's think before I go on what viral is, or virus, because viral is not the same thing as virus. The virus crosses boundaries it's not supposed to, or at least ones it likes crossing, and changes itself after it crosses, changes what it lands in, and probably changes the boundary, of course. So notice all the mobility we've just added. You know, so you never can repeat the boundary either, you know. And you can hear from the beginning, I've been moving towards this, but it's a little move. The mathematics will work by infection. The measuring will work by infection. This is not what you get in Barad for sure. Where active and passive parasitic forces mark the obliqueness of the environment that never reaches a point of equilibrium, insofar as any stability is mobile, directed by vectors of attraction and repulsion. Vectors, lots of stuff in there, attraction and repulsion, and far, far, far from equilibrium. So these are new ideas about systems. I think it's really finally going to take us beyond systems thinking. At least that's what I would like to hope for some reason. They never reach the point of freedom. Thus, the mathematics or digital architecture that Parisi is considering is a parasiting architecture, a deployment of viral ecologies or dense folds of information between zeros and ones. This mathematics trades and distributes variations across milieu of interaction, allowing simultaneous communication between different processors and the sharing of memory and message transmission. These communications involve many very simple algorithms, which, however, do not lead to the evolution of one algorithm, so everything's working in funny little ways, or the other, but to a new algorithmic behavior. So you change the way the algorithm works, or it has the capacity to change itself in its meeting with other things. Notice the link, computationally open and viral. Patricia says, say something about viral, but I did. Here, I'm heading back to the organism and the body through a detour in evolution, because in all of her work, Parisi draws on recently deceased Lynn Margulis's conceptualization of endosymbiosis. Endosymbiosis differs from a genetics of cumulative selection of random mutations, which is the old Darwinian notion. Instead, evolution comes by way of parallel entity, viral, jumping, not accumulating in your species, but hopping over to another species, and then maybe changing what every species was before and after. Instead, evolution comes by way of parallel entities whose independent activity remains independently active in any new composite, changing the functional organization of the new composite or body. So in a symbiotic architecture, there is parallel processing which cannot be contained in a single lineage. And in case you forget, this was the big feminist movement. Not contained in a single lineage, nor is it inheritable in a filiative fashion. So we just jettisoned ourselves out of the family. Baby, it's fine. It points instead to a labyrinth in evolution. A symbiotic or parasitic architecture can take account of and affect experiential dimensions of what has not been cognitively experienced, or transitions between blocks of space-time from one state to another, virally transgressing boundaries. So something is happening at the level that we're nowhere near, and a lot of other things aren't either. For Parisi, this is an abstract machine that entails an engineering patchwork of partialities passing from one state to another, fusing and breaking into each other, and yet belonging together at points of transitions where are less irreducible dots than inflections, critical thresholds, curvatures of imperceptible continuities. Put your head in a program, or in the universe. Put your head in a program and what has to really go on there to make certain things happen. So it's I always think of her as the poet of programming. Okay, let's finish. While Parisi has drawn links between this mathematics and quantum theory, more recently she has linked to nanotechnology. For Parisi, specific novelty of nanotechnologies is that nanomachines can rearrange the very position of every atom. This means that each atom can be placed in a selected position to become an active or structural component of a living system that is being redesigned all the way down to the atom. In particular, this new capacity of controlling the position of atoms suggests that the high-speed oscillation and fuzziness of molecules, which was central to the discoveries of quantum physics, is no longer an absolute indeterminacy. So we're moving past quantum physics here, defined by an atomic superposition between particles and waves. Rather, the fuzziness provides a chaotic instability that could be turned into a weird dynamic productivity. And I don't know if you've gone online to see what they can do with nano, but It's really amazing. I mean, to give you a real sense of it, I might be able to move this by just pushing my hand, and it'll get lower, it'll reform, maybe I can make it into a chair. So we actually have a technology that's going to let us manipulate things that really stand in our mind as inert and immovable. And so it's going to really give us the experience of this very abstract stuff I'm talking to you about. The high-speed oscillation, rather fuzziness provides a chaotic instability that could be turned into a weird dynamic predictivity, because you want to make something that keeps on being able to move. At the nanoscale, Parisi continues, particles can become probability waves which leap across impenetrable barriers, occupy two places at the same time, and anticipate future states. So maybe we're in sci-fi. From the science of nanotechnology to the nano-design of artificial atoms, for what has been trademarked programmable matter, the aim, as Parisi sees it, is to neutralize the distinction between physical composition, atoms, photons, protons, electrons, and their properties, color, shape, smoothness, brightness, and so on. So we're used to change, you have a blue sweater, I have an orange, so we know it's a sweater. So we're used to changing colors and things like that belong to matter, but if I now could make your sweater turn into a skirt, maybe you can at H&M. So you know what I mean. And to think of those as the same. And I just want to say very quickly, all of philosophy has dealt with primary qualities that cannot be changed, and secondary qualities which are produced like phenomena or through human. I make blue, I make orange. Because, that distinction, we make it. We can talk about the light as well. But now more and more we're going to not be just through the phenomena, because we can change the most intense primary qualities. I really am finishing my poems. At work here, Parisi sees it to neutralize the distinction between physical compositions such that material can change their substance instantaneously, like the design or debugging of software. Parisi sums up by proposing that by entering the realm of pure potentials of color, shape, roughness, electricity, vectoriality, etc., programmable matter promises an architecture of instantaneous realization of potentialities. At work here, control no longer is intended as the calculation of future by means of prediction, or the calculation of the unknown through preset probabilities. The disappearance of the biophysical contingencies instead is directly proportional to the nanoprogram of uncertainties as the inclusion of fuzzy states around 0 and 1 in the design of thought and extension. I'm not even reading it. Okay, I'm closing. If we have left, okay, I'll read it once. The disappearance of biophysical contingencies instead is directly proportional to the nanoprogramming of uncertainties, because it can take its uncertainty and act on something immediately, because those are not contingencies to its action anymore. Proportional to the nanoprogramming of uncertainties is the inclusion of the fuzzy states around 0 and 1 in the design of thought and extension. And remember, thought cannot be a thought with a technology. So there's technology all over this, it's mathematical technology. If we have left behind thinking of the body as only human, I want to close speculating that the body as organism, or more specifically the autopoietic organism, is no longer a fitting figure for life, or for dynamic matter, or for capturing the relationship of matter and life, given the bio, nano, mathematical, technological developments feminist science studies scholars have been attending to. As you may recall, the autopoietic organism is one whose functional organization, the relationship of the liver and the heart, cannot admit new information or informational change or reorganization without possibly incurring death. So we get bigger and our structures change. We get bigger, but our internal operation does never change, or you die. Or it's below a place of changing the organization. In fact, Umberto Maturana first defined autopoiesis as characterizing an informatic system that is closed to new information. What this means is that in every interaction between the organism and the environment, the organism reproduces its informational organization. It reproduces its own poiesis. But I am proposing that the new materialism is leading us to rethink the figure of life, such that there can be a refiguring of the body that renders life's capacity to change its organization in its relationship to technological environment, or an environment that is always technological and always has been. This goes beyond the cyborg, of course, even beyond Haraway's material semiotic objects and Barad's agentic interactional objects, to the open computationality of curvilinearity, of parasitic parallel programming design, and perhaps a biotechnological evolutionary leap. As I have already suggested, in her recent work on evolution, Elizabeth Gross has argued against opposing life and matter, that is to say, the dialectical tradition of negating matter or overcoming it in order to have life. Gross makes clear that there is aliveness in matter, such that whenever matter unwinds itself, I'm quoting, whenever matter unwinds itself, it does so with the tiniest measure of indeterminacy or the chance for the emergence of life and for differentiation into numberless living individuals and species. For Gross, life is matter extended into the virtual, and matter is life compressed into dormancy. Life erupts from and transforms the material conditions that enable matter to remember. Now it is this remembering that becomes in Gross's view an interiority. So she has a dynamic matter, life lifts off of it, and it's that lifting off, and that becomes an interiority leading to a consciousness that distinguishes life from matter without diminishing their intense ongoing intimacy. But the point I am making is that this turning in, this remembering from within, an internal folding, this self-surveying or contemplation is precisely what is under pressure with nanotechnology, where every quality, primary and secondary of matter, can be reprogrammed instantly, a transformation of inside and outside, as if matter had what Deleuze called a brain, or where life, its membrane, is less a clean boundary than a multiplicity, fostering the imposition of the virtual and the actual, the representation of which is a fluctuating network rather than an organism. And this is where we are, in the ever-transformed understanding of bodies and technologies, as a new cohort of feminist scholars see it, a cohort of scholars who have given themselves over to a deep engagement with science and technology, and found there a certain terrifying possibilities, but also virtual outlines of a future life. Thank you. Very nice audience. I feel you hung in.
Well, it's a very rich paper, and I think we've got to be disciplined if we're going to have enough questions. I propose that we go beyond 2:30 in order to have enough time for questions. So let's start.
I have a small note about nanotechnology. You probably, as me, remember 70s, when very serious scientists predicted that by 2000 we will be part of intergalactic civilization and will have biological robots, and what we have now. And I recently saw a picture of a person who predicted something like this in 1967, and now this person lives something like on footsteps. So these predictions very...
Are you telling me I'm going to live on footsteps?
I actually like very much your presentation, and I got a lot of information, but these predictions are very speculative from my point of view.
Yes. Do you want to do more than one? Or
Yeah,
let's do maybe 2 or 3. But that's, of course, a great one.
Well, I have an old-fashioned question. I got interested in the vulnerability of the human body in order to defend human rights against what I thought was relativism. And part of the problem for me with the concept of vulnerability was how to distinguish between animals and humans. And I kind of gave up on the problem because it seemed to me I couldn't sort of establish any kind of reasonable boundaries. So my question is, what's the implication of this research for concepts about rights in relation to things that we call human? There's a question.
And one
Yeah,
more.
very rustic question.
Very what kind?
Rustic.
Rustic.
I couldn't help but to think about identity when you were talking about the phenomenon of our technological society and observation as kind of recreating the object. So if you could speak a little bit about identity, what would constitute identity then?
Maybe those questions are so related, and I think it's interesting to think how often I was making clear that none of this is predictive science, actually. So you mean predictions probably in the more cultural sense of the term, you know, predicting things are going to happen by 2000. So this, for me, this isn't about predicting the future and what will happen. Or even, I mean, not that one couldn't, as you just did, do a history of predictions that fail. But you also could do the most amazing, because having studied cybernetics many, many years ago, the things that happened that they never thought could happen, that actually did happen and are happening. So very quickly, because we could argue about this for a long time, because it's the right question, of course, and I don't have I'm not predicting. I'm entering the imagination of ongoing scientific and technological thought and extension, precisely because none of us think outside of one. And it'll help us think about the ones we've been using for like 100 years, or St. Augustine maybe. You know, I mean, really. You know, and so it's at the edges, not so much of science. So that's why I'm happy for this question, because otherwise I'd say, oh really, I'm so embarrassed. But, you know, like, but for the edges of philosophy and feminism and different kinds of theories that brought them here. So speculative, absolutely. And I'm happy about that. I'm happy to be a speculative thinker. That's what I want to be. It doesn't then mean what are the implications for your speculation without any concern. So I didn't have enough time, but you know, none of the thinkers that I draw on, Farad, Parisi, and Gross. Well, Gross does a kind of politics, but it's different. But Farad and Parisi, well, all of them are totally aware and have written about capitalism and governance, and I could have gone on. In fact, I really think it's important to see, if I could have gone on, the cross between biopolitical governance, this kind of technology, and the thought of it even if it doesn't get realized in some way. These are really political questions about what's pressuring the links we've made in the past, Brian's question, between science, technology, and biopolitics or any kind of governance, and human rights, and what we mean by the human, and what were the philosophical and technological assumptions of human rights in the first place, or what we think about it. So there's a bunch of stuff that has to be, and I really do try in my work to do that, but I also feel like we need more people to work together to do these things, right? And we have them, thank God. I mean, people are asking these kind of questions about what's the ethics and stuff. But ethics to me, and I'm not sure it's my favorite word, but maybe it is, ethics to me has to join the performative capacity that's in front of us. Otherwise, it becomes maybe an ethics against anything happening, which worries me a lot, because a lot of people who are unethical will make things happen. So maybe not, I don't know. Defending the human body. Well, you know, I know you know, Brian, that there are all these other creaturely lives that need a little defending themselves, especially from the human body. So, you know, we're definitely flattening the plane of what constitutes, you know, life. And that's a big
I thought you would end up, or I would end up with, a conception of rights of being, rather than rights of humans or rights of animals.
Well, that might be nice. That might be very nice.
Rights of
But maybe rights, you know, then I have to put on another hat, you know, about what the debate is about rights. But, you know, it joins another debate. But that's a move, and I do like that. I do like that. Yeah. Oh, I did, yes. Yes. I'll do the identity again.
If you could slow down a little bit with this sort of post-cyborgian becoming. So, you know, I think you clearly walked us through this autopoetic subject, the cyborg articulations, you give us a lot of different figures of these vibrant matters that are getting fuzzy on the edges, but I was wondering if you could just slow down with what that
Where you
singularity
want
might be, this future post.
What,
You
do
know,
you have
so-
something in your head going on?
Well,
that
no,
I can
I'm just trying to, I
See
mean,
it.
well, let me also frame this by saying, I follow Young and Bateson and sort of dividing the world into the realm of creatura and pleroma, right? The things that have metabolisms, the things that are informatic systems,
Yeah, thank you.
and then the other sorts of things.
Yeah.
And what you're doing is messing with that a little
I
bit.
am, yeah.
And I guess I would like to have a better sense of what these cyborgs are to become
Yeah,
with
you know,
that messiness.
I think we will be terribly disappointed with this. You know, Liz Gross, too, that I quoted at the end, you know, some of us here were just reading this piece. It's a very beautiful piece by Elizabeth. It's one of the prettiest things it's very pretty, but it's about a way to, although to give everything I almost give to matter, which she does, but then she distinguishes light from matter.
Mm.
Never that it's completely distinguished. I think we came across, used the word it laminates together or something, because she thinks all life is headed for consciousnness. And so it could be Whiteheadian, and that consciousness has something to do with creating a boundary. It defined as self-surveying. Those were her words. I didn't do all the quotey things because we're not publishing, and just so what I've said to students recently was, I think she's right and I'm wrong, but that's why I want to do it. I mean, I'm serious. It's a practice for me to try to imagine it, partly political reasons, partly because she also doesn't look at mathematics and technology like Parisi does. So, and it would fall more like you, that some things are this and some things are not. And, you know, we have everyone knows that all scales of matter are alive, but some of them have almost the most uninteresting liveliness we can imagine, and some have much more interesting. I wouldn't mind doing that, but even, you know, I'm playing around with that a little bit. So yes, you're right. So I don't have a picture of what they look like. Right now they're living on a screen.
Can I suggest we collect the questions,
And
but
one more then.
but we don't answer them all, okay? So
Oh,
let's, let's hear the questions.
Yes, and give me tell me when to stop. That's all.
Okay, so this is a quick follow-up. So I think so you refer to Whitehead and Deleuze, and Elizabeth Gross refers to Bergson.
Who?
Bergson.
Bergson,
Yeah,
yes.
which are inspiring
Yes,
Whitehead and
okay.
Deleuze.
Yes.
So and he makes the difference in terms of memory.
Oh, for sure.
And I think that might be a good way to sort of to like, you know, recapture that notion in your words of tendencies, because in a way there's no way of spelling out the tendencies and the potentialities and the virtual without past, without history.
Right.
Okay, more questions.
But that could bridge, sorry, like culture, history and matter, and history and organism. Sorry.
Yes, please.
Don't call and ask because she'll ask me a really hard question.
So, I'll
I'm
stand to
kidding.
get away from I'm coming from the field of somatic and spiritual psychology. So your question about culture and rights, and what I heard you talking about has to do with restriction and motivation. Did I hear that correctly? Boundaries?
I'll touch on it.
All right. So and what that has
It's
to
a
do
good
with,
question.
yeah. And what happens? What does that have to do with the inception of consciousness, especially from what you said about the prehensive states?
And I think there's one more question, which is this.
It's actually not a hard question.
Oh, good.
I'll ask you a question. I'm interested in the relationship between
I'm
finite
so happy to see
potentiality
you.
and the non-human. And I wonder if you could clarify the relationship, the distinction of Parisi's work versus Rod. I don't necessarily think you have to read Rod as, in a sense, where the measure excludes possibilities. It's one way to read her. But so the way I see this reading as that potentialities or possibilities exist before in interaction. And
But
one
do you think she
can-
says that?
One
You
can
do.
read her as
Ah,
being,
okay.
I'm trying to get to the notion of event that in Whitehead and Parisi, I also think happened in time.
Okay, so we have to close up, so, and we'll, really, these are great, these are more, very engaged questions. First of all, my difference between me and Liz Gross, which we've actually had, is Bergson. My Deleuze is not Bergson Deleuze. I'm a Spinoza Deleuze, and I think it makes a difference. I think Bergson, I'd have to work really hard to bring him into digital. I think, so, but you raise a really important question for me, and that's about memory and time and past. That you're right, I haven't worked it out. And beyond just like demonstrating what's going on to you, if I had an agenda, it would be that. And I think it would come closer to Astrid, what is the event? And Whitehead also talks about excluding things, but they come back. And so, I was doing the one piece from Barad, and you've asked me before to do her better, but I think it's you who does her better, frankly. The thing, I do, because I don't think that's quite in her, but it doesn't matter. The ideas matter to me than who doing them. This is a bigger question, but because I don't know, but it's a fun. I'm sure I never used the word motivation at all, but intent or intention at all. All words that are sort of submerged in the piece, covered by other words like agency or indeterminacy. I think the prehensive is the motivation that opens up to all of life, and it's before anything. So, sorry, thank you so much.